In the small town of Cedar Falls, Margaret Collins had worked as a nurse for 37 years. She thought she'd seen everything that could walk through the doors of Riverside Community Clinic. Late one autumn evening, as she prepared to close, a barefoot little girl burst through the entrance, tears streaming down her dirt-stained cheeks. "Please," the child sobbed, grabbing Margaret's uniform with trembling hands. "My mama won't wake up. She's lying in the parking lot, and she won't talk to me." What Margaret discovered that night would challenge everything she believed about healing, family, and the quiet desperation that lives behind closed doors in small communities. The mother's condition was just the beginning of a story that would unravel 3 generations of hidden pain. But what would Margaret do when she realized that saving this family might cost her everything she'd built? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret Collins had always believed that nursing was more than a profession. It was a calling that chose you, not the other way around. At 62, with silver hair pulled back in the same practical bun she'd worn for decades, she moved through the corridors of Riverside Community Clinic with the quiet confidence of someone who had witnessed birth, death, and everything in between. The clinic itself reflected the character of Cedar Falls, modest, dependable, and weathered by time. Built in 1978, the single-story brick building housed 6 examination rooms, a small laboratory, and Margaret's domain, the triage area where she served as the first point of contact for anyone seeking medical care. The waiting room's blue carpet had faded to an indeterminate grey blue, and the magazines were always at least 6 months old, but the place radiated a warmth that came from genuine care rather than modern amenities. On her desk, positioned where she could see it every day, sat a small, black-and-white photograph in a simple wooden frame. The image showed a young woman with bright eyes and an eager smile, dressed in a crisp white nursing uniform and cap. Margaret Collins, age 25, on her graduation day from St. Mary's School of Nursing. That young woman had believed she could heal the world, one patient at a time. The older Margaret, who looked at that photo each morning, carried different burdens: the weight of experience, the knowledge of limitations, and most recently, the hollow ache of loss. Tom had been gone for 8 months now. 8 months since the heart attack that claimed her husband of 34 years in their sleep, leaving Margaret to wake up alone in their queen-sized bed with its blue floral comforter. 8 months of cooking for one, of evening news watched in silence, of decisions made without consultation. The grief had settled into her bones like arthritis, a constant dull presence that she had learned to work around rather than through. "Margaret, you staying late again?" Dr. Harrison's voice carried the gentle concern of someone who had worked alongside her for the better part of 2 decades. At 67, William Harrison was 3 years past the retirement age he kept postponing, much to his wife's consternation. His white hair had thinned considerably, and his once steady hands showed the slight tremor that made him rely more heavily on Margaret's assistance during procedures. "Just finishing up the supply inventory," Margaret replied, not looking up from her clipboard. The truth was, she found reasons to stay late most evenings. The empty house on Maple Street held too much quiet, too many memories of shared dinners and comfortable conversations. Here at the clinic, surrounded by the familiar sounds of the building settling and the soft hum of medical equipment, she felt useful. "Linda left you the Peterson file on your desk," Dr. Harrison continued, settling into the chair across from her station. "Follow up for the diabetes check. And Mrs. Chen called about her prescription refill. I told Linda to have the pharmacy ready it for pickup tomorrow." Linda Martinez had been the clinic's receptionist for 12 years, a cheerful woman in her 40s who managed to remember every patient's name and most of their family details. She possessed the remarkable ability to make even the most anxious visitors feel welcome, often greeting regulars with questions about their grandchildren or updates on their garden tomatoes. Her presence during the day helped maintain the clinic's reputation as more than just a medical facility. It was a cornerstone of community life. Cedar Falls itself embodied the essence of small-town America that existed in pockets throughout the Midwest. Population 3,147, according to the last census, though Margaret suspected it was closer to 3,600 now, as young people continued their exodus to larger cities with more opportunities. Main Street boasted Hartley's hardware store, Thompson's Diner, First National Bank of Cedar Falls, and a handful of other businesses that had served multiple generations of families. The surrounding countryside stretched out in gentle rolling hills dotted with family farms, many of which had been passed down through generations. Corn and soybean fields created a patchwork quilt visible from the clinic's windows, changing colors with the seasons, green shoots in spring, golden waves. In late summer, brown stubble in winter. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where secrets were hard to keep, and where Margaret Collins had earned her reputation as someone you could trust with your deepest concerns. Over 37 years, Margaret had delivered babies who were now bringing their own children to the clinic. She'd held hands with the dying, comforted families receiving devastating diagnoses and celebrated recoveries that seemed miraculous. She had learned to read between the lines when patients described their symptoms, understanding that sometimes the physical ailment was secondary to emotional pain that had no easy cure. The work had shaped her into someone who listened more than she spoke, who could assess a situation with a glance, and who understood that healing often required more than medication. She had developed an intuition about people, when they were hiding something, when they were afraid to ask the real question, when they needed permission to grieve or forgive or simply rest. But lately, Margaret found herself questioning whether she still made a difference. The young nursing graduates who occasionally rotated through the clinic seemed full of energy and modern techniques she felt too old to learn. Technology continued to evolve faster than her ability to adapt. Electronic health records had replaced the handwritten charts she preferred. Insurance requirements grew more complex each year, requiring more paperwork and less time with actual patients. Some days, particularly the difficult ones when nothing seemed to go right, Margaret wondered if it might be time to consider retirement. She had enough saved, and her pension from the hospital system would provide adequately. She could travel, perhaps visit her sister in Oregon, take up gardening seriously instead of just tending the small herb patch behind her house. Yet, every time she seriously considered leaving, something would happen to remind her why she had chosen this profession. A successful treatment that restored someone's quality of life, a word of gratitude from a family member, a moment when her experience proved invaluable in ways that couldn't be quantified or replaced by technology. This evening had started like countless others. Dr. Harrison had finished his last appointment around 5:30 and headed home to dinner with Eleanor. Linda had locked the reception area, turned off the computers, and waved goodbye as she left for her evening ritual of helping her teenage son with homework. Margaret remained to complete the tasks that kept the clinic running smoothly, restocking supplies, reviewing the next day's appointments, ensuring that everything was in order. The October air carried the scent of burning leaves and the promise of winter. Margaret could see her breath when she had stepped outside earlier to retrieve the mail from the box beside the entrance. The clinic's parking lot, illuminated by 2 tall security lights, stretched empty except for her reliable Honda Civic, which had served her faithfully for the past 8 years. Inside, the building held the particular quietude that settles over medical facilities after hours. The fluorescent lights in the main corridor remained on, casting their steady glow over linoleum floors that Linda mopped each evening before leaving. The examination room stood ready for tomorrow's patients, each equipped with the basic necessities: examination table covered in fresh paper, blood pressure cuff, thermometer, and the countless small instruments that Margaret could locate and prepare without conscious thought. She moved through her closing routine with practiced efficiency, checking that all controlled medications were properly secured, ensuring that the autoclave had completed its sterilization cycle, verifying that emergency supplies were fully stocked. These rituals provided comfort in their predictability, markers of a job done thoroughly and conscientiously. As Margaret prepared to turn off the lights and lock the door, she paused at her desk one final time. The black and white graduation photograph seemed to regard her with that young woman's optimism and certainty. 37 years ago, that earnest nursing student had believed she understood what lay ahead, a career of helping others, making a difference, being part of something larger than herself. She couldn't have imagined the complexity of what that would actually mean, the weight of responsibility, the accumulation of sorrows alongside the joys, the way that caring for others would sometimes come at the expense of caring for herself. She couldn't have predicted the night shifts that left her exhausted, the difficult diagnoses she would have to deliver, the families she would have to comfort when comfort seemed impossible. But she also couldn't have anticipated the profound satisfaction that came from truly knowing her community, from being trusted with people's most vulnerable moments, from witnessing the strength and resilience that emerged from ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges. Margaret reached for her purse and coat, ready to end another day. Outside, Cedar Falls settled into evening routines, dinners being prepared, homework being supervised, television programs beginning. Soon she would drive home to Maple Street, heat up leftover soup, and spend the evening reading before an early bedtime that would prepare her for another day of serving her community's medical needs. She had no way of knowing that her carefully ordered world was about to be completely disrupted by a barefoot child whose desperate plea would challenge everything she thought she understood about healing, family, and the true cost of caring for others. The sound of the clinic's front door slamming against the wall shattered the evening quiet like a gunshot. Margaret's hand froze halfway to the light switch as she heard bare feet slapping against the linoleum floor, accompanied by the kind of sobbing that comes from a child's deepest terror. "Hello? Is someone there? Please, somebody help me." Margaret dropped her purse and moved quickly toward the reception area, her nursing instincts taking over before her mind could fully process what was happening. What she saw when she rounded the corner would remain etched in her memory for the rest of her life. A little girl, no more than 8 years old, stood in the middle of the waiting room. Her dark hair hung in tangled strands around a face streaked with dirt and tears. She wore a thin cotton dress, pink with faded unicorns, that was torn at the shoulder and stained with something Margaret couldn't immediately identify. But it was the child's feet that made Margaret's heart clench, bare, cut and bleeding from what must have been a desperate run across gravel and pavement. "Sweetheart," Margaret said, automatically lowering her voice to the calm, soothing tone she used. With frightened patience, "What's wrong? Where are your parents?" The girl's eyes, large and brown and wild with panic, fixed on Margaret's face. "Are you a doctor? My mama needs a doctor. She won't wake up, and I shook her, but she just lies there and there's blood." "Slow down, honey." Margaret knelt to the child's eye level, noting how the girl's entire body trembled. "I'm a nurse, and I'm going to help you. What's your name?" "Emma. Emma Rodriguez. My mama's in the parking lot and she fell down, and I don't know what to do." The words tumbled out between gasping sobs. "There's nobody else. Grandma Maria lives too far, and I don't have a phone, and Mama always said if something bad happened to come here because the nurse lady would help." Margaret felt something cold settle in her stomach. She had been the nurse lady to countless children over the years, the trusted adult they were taught to seek in emergencies. But seeing this terrified child, alone and injured, drove home. The weight of that responsibility in a way she hadn't felt in years. "Okay, Emma, you did exactly the right thing by coming here." Margaret stood and reached for the emergency phone. "I'm going to call for an ambulance, and then we're going to go help your mama together. Can you tell me what happened?" "She was walking to the store to get milk because I spilled the last of it this morning, and she said it was okay. Accidents happen, but then she wanted to get more before the store closed." Emma wiped her nose with the back of her hand, leaving another streak of dirt across her cheek. "She told me to stay home, but I followed her because she's been acting funny lately, real tired, and sometimes she just stares at nothing." Margaret was already dialing 911 while processing what Emma was telling her. A woman collapsing on the way to the store, unusual fatigue, behavioral changes. The possibilities ran through her mind, none of them good for a mother apparently caring for a child alone. "This is Margaret Collins at Riverside Community Clinic," she said when the dispatcher answered. "I need an ambulance immediately. We have an unconscious woman in our parking lot with a child who appears to be injured." As she provided the necessary details, Margaret watched Emma fidget with the torn edge of her dress. The child's fingernails were bitten down to the quick, and Margaret noticed what looked like old bruises on her upper arms, faded yellow-green marks that spoke of previous injuries. "Emma, while we wait for the ambulance, let me clean up those cuts on your feet." Margaret guided the child to one of the examination rooms, automatically reaching for supplies. "How far did you run to get here?" "From Elm Street. Mama fell by the big oak tree near Peterson's fence, and I tried to wake her up, but she wouldn't open her eyes. She was breathing, though. I could see her chest moving up and down like when she sleeps." Margaret knelt again, this time to examine Emma's feet. The cuts weren't deep, but they were numerous and filled with small pieces of gravel. As she began cleaning them with gentle efficiency, she continued her assessment of the situation. "Emma, is it just you and your mama at home most of the time? Sometimes my daddy comes around, but mama says he can't stay because he makes bad choices. And sometimes Uncle Carlos visits, but he lives in the city and has his own family. What about your grandma Maria? You mentioned her earlier." Emma winced as Margaret removed a piece of gravel from her heel. "She lives way out on the old farm. A road. Mama says it's too far to walk, and we don't have a car anymore because Daddy took it when he left last month." The pieces of a larger picture were beginning to form in Margaret's mind. A single mother apparently struggling financially, possibly dealing with health issues, caring for a young daughter with limited support. The kind of situation that existed quietly in small communities, hidden behind closed doors, until crisis forced it into the open. "There," Margaret said, applying the last bandage to Emma's feet. "That should feel better. Now let's go see about your mama." They heard the ambulance sirens as they made their way outside. Margaret grabbed a penlight and emergency medical kit, her mind shifting into the focused mode that had served her through countless emergencies. But this felt different, more personal, weighted with the understanding that she was looking at a family in crisis that extended far beyond whatever medical emergency had brought them together tonight. The scene in the parking lot confirmed Margaret's growing sense of dread. A woman in her early 30s lay motionless beneath the large oak tree that bordered the clinic property. She was thin, too thin, with dark hair similar to Emma's, and the kind of pale complexion that suggested chronic illness or poor nutrition. Her clothes were clean but obviously worn, and Margaret noticed that she wore only one shoe. The other lay several feet away, where it had apparently come off when she fell. "Mama!" Emma broke away from Margaret and ran toward the prone figure, but Margaret caught her arm gently. Let me check her first, sweetheart. The paramedics are almost here. Margaret knelt beside the woman and immediately began her assessment. Pulse. Present but rapid and thready, breathing shallow but regular. No obvious signs of trauma, but her skin felt clammy and cold. When Margaret lifted one of the woman's eyelids, she noted that the pupils were responsive, but the overall presentation suggested someone dealing with more than just a simple fainting spell. Her name is Rosa, Emma said quietly, crouching beside Margaret. Rosa Rodriguez. She's 32, and she cleans houses for people, and sometimes she gets really tired after work. The ambulance pulled into the parking lot, its red and blue lights painting the scene in alternating colors. Margaret felt Emma's small hand slip into hers as the paramedics approached with their equipment and stretcher. "What do we have?" asked Jake Morrison, a paramedic Margaret had worked with many times over the years. 32-year-old female, found unconscious by her daughter approximately 15 minutes ago. Pulse is rapid and thready. Breathing is shallow, skin is clammy. No obvious trauma, but the child reports recent behavioral changes and fatigue. As the paramedics took over Rosa's care, Margaret noticed Emma's grip on her hand tighten. The child watched every movement, every procedure, with the intense focus of someone who understood that her world might be about to change forever. "Is she going to be okay?" Emma whispered. Margaret looked down at this brave little girl who had run barefoot through the streets to seek help for her mother, who had trusted in the kindness of the nurse lady, even when everything else seemed to be falling apart. In that moment, Margaret realized that whatever was wrong with Rosa Rodriguez was only the beginning of a story that would test everything she thought she knew about healing, family, and the true cost of caring for others. "We're going to do everything we can to help her," Margaret said, the words carrying a weight of promise that she was only beginning to understand. The emergency room at Cedar Falls General Hospital buzzed with the controlled urgency that Margaret knew well from her earlier years working in critical care. She sat in the uncomfortable plastic chair beside Emma, who clutched a juice box the triage nurse had given her and stared fixedly at the doors where her mother had disappeared an hour ago. "Mrs. Collins?" Dr. Patricia Henley emerged from the treatment area, her expression carefully neutral in the way that medical professionals learn to master. Margaret had known Patricia since she was a resident, a competent physician who had chosen to stay in small-town medicine rather than pursue the lucrative specialties that drew many of her colleagues to larger cities. "How is she?" Margaret asked, rising from her chair while keeping one hand on Emma's shoulder. "Stable, but we're still running tests. Her blood sugar was dangerously low when she came in, and there are signs of severe dehydration and malnutrition. We've got her on IV fluids and glucose, and she's conscious now, though still quite weak." Emma looked up sharply. "Can I see her?" Dr. Henley glanced at Margaret, a silent communication passing between them. "In a few minutes, honey. The nurses are getting her settled in a room first." "Doctor," Margaret said quietly, "may I speak with you privately for a moment?" They walked a few steps away, still within sight of Emma, but out of earshot. Margaret noticed how the child watched their every movement, her young face already learning to read the subtle signs that indicated whether news would be good or bad. "What aren't you telling me?" Margaret asked. "Honestly, I'm concerned this isn't just a one-time incident. Her condition suggests chronic undernourishment, possibly diabetes that's been going untreated. Her clothes were clean, but they're several sizes too large, as if she's lost significant weight recently. And Margaret," Dr. Henley paused, choosing her words carefully, "the child shows signs of chronic stress, anxiety behaviors, hypervigilance. I need to ask, have you noticed anything that might suggest neglect or abuse?" Margaret felt her chest tighten. "Emma said it's just the two of them most of the time. The father left recently, took their car, no close family nearby. The child seems devoted to her mother, and Rosa apparently taught her to come to the clinic in an emergency. That doesn't sound like neglect to me. It sounds like a mother doing her best in difficult circumstances. I hope you're right, but I'm required to notify social services when we see these kinds of indicators, especially with a child involved. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She looked back at Emma, who was methodically tearing small pieces from her juice box. Label, a nervous habit that spoke of a child who had learned to find ways to cope with uncertainty. What will happen to Emma if Rosa needs extended care? That depends on several factors: whether we can locate suitable family members, what social services determines about the home situation, how quickly Rosa recovers. Dr. Henley's expression softened slightly. Margaret, I know you have a good heart, but this isn't your responsibility. These situations are complex, and there are systems in place to handle them. But even as Dr. Henley spoke, Margaret felt something shift inside her, a sense of connection to this child and her mother that went beyond professional duty. Over 3 decades of nursing had taught her to recognize the difference between families in temporary crisis and those facing deeper systemic problems. The Rodriguez family felt like the former, even if their circumstances appeared dire. A memory surfaced suddenly. Her own childhood, the year her father lost his job at the grain elevator, and her mother cleaned houses to keep food on the table. Margaret remembered the shame of wearing clothes from the church donation box, the careful rationing of groceries, the way her parents spoke in hushed tones about bills they couldn't pay. She remembered, too, the kindness of Mrs. Patterson, their neighbor, who always seemed to have extra soup or fresh bread to share, who never made it feel like charity. "I'd like to stay with Emma tonight," Margaret heard herself saying, "until we know more about Rosa's condition and what happens next." Dr. Henley looked surprised. "Margaret, that's not necessary. Social services has emergency foster families. She's frightened and alone. She ran barefoot through the streets to find help because her mother taught her to trust medical personnel. The least I can do is provide some continuity until her family situation is sorted out. You barely know this child. I know enough." Margaret's voice carried a quiet firmness that surprised them both. "I know she loves her mother enough to risk everything to save her. I know she's been taking care of herself, and probably her mother too, and I know what it feels like to be a child, watching your world fall apart while adults make decisions about your future." Before Dr. Henley could respond, a social worker appeared, a young woman with a clipboard and the kind of earnest expression that Margaret recognized as someone new to the job, still believing she could fix every broken situation she encountered. "Are you here about the Rodriguez case?" the woman asked. "I'm Jennifer Walsh from Children and Family Services. I need to ask the child some questions and assess the home situation." Margaret watched Jennifer approach Emma with professional cheerfulness, noting how the child immediately became more guarded, her shoulders tensing as she sensed another adult who might have the power to change her life. The questions began gently. What grade was Emma in? Did she like school? Could she tell Jennifer about a typical day at home? But Margaret could see Emma's careful responses, the way she was already learning to navigate the system that had suddenly entered her life. When Jennifer asked about food at home, Emma said they ate dinner together every night. When asked about bedtime routines, Emma described how her mother read to her from library books. When asked if she ever felt scared or unsafe, Emma's answer was a firm no. All technically true, Margaret suspected, but not the whole truth. Emma was protecting her mother, even in these circumstances, showing the kind of loyalty that spoke of a loving relationship despite whatever hardships they faced. "Mrs. Collins," Jennifer said, turning to Margaret after finishing her initial interview, "Emma says you're a nurse at the clinic where she went for help. Are you familiar with this family?" "This is the first time I've met them," Margaret admitted, but I can tell you that Emma showed remarkable presence of mind in seeking help for her mother. She knew exactly where to go and who to trust. That suggests good parenting and a strong family bond. Jennifer made notes on her clipboard, her expression unreadable. I'll need to visit their home and speak with neighbors to get a fuller picture. In the meantime, Emma will need somewhere to stay while her mother is hospitalized. She can stay with me, Margaret said firmly. I'm a registered nurse with no criminal background, and I live alone in a safe neighborhood. Emma knows me, and it would provide stability during what's obviously a traumatic time. Both Dr. Henley and Jennifer looked surprised by this offer. Margaret herself was somewhat shocked by her own words, but they felt right in a way that her carefully ordered life hadn't felt right in months. That's very generous, Jennifer said slowly. But there are procedures, background checks, home visits, approval processes. How long do those take? Several days, possibly a week. Margaret looked at Emma, who was listening to every word, with the intense focus of a child whose future was being decided by strangers. And in the meantime, emergency foster placement. The phrase hung in the air like a death sentence. Margaret had seen enough emergency placements over the years to know that, however well-intentioned, they often meant another layer of trauma for children who were already struggling to understand their changing world. 3 hours later, Margaret found herself standing in the cramped living room of a small apartment on Elm Street, watching Emma gather a few belongings while Jennifer Walsh conducted her home assessment. The apartment told a story that broke Margaret's heart in its quiet dignity. The furniture was old but clean, a couch with a faded floral pattern covered by a handmade throw, a coffee table with one wobbly leg propped up by folded cardboard, shelves lined with library books organized by size rather than subject. The kitchen was spotless, though Margaret noticed that the refrigerator held only basic necessities: milk, bread, a few vegetables, sandwich meat that would last several days if carefully rationed. What struck her most was the evidence of care woven throughout the small space. Emma's school artwork was carefully displayed on the refrigerator with colorful magnets. A reading corner had been created near the window, with cushions arranged around a small basket of library books. Rosa had clearly worked to make their modest circumstances feel like a home rather than just a place to survive. "Mama keeps our special things in here," Emma said, opening a wooden box on the kitchen counter. Inside, Margaret glimpsed photographs, a few pieces of jewelry that looked like family heirlooms, and what appeared to be letters tied with a ribbon. "She says these are our treasures, the things that remind us who we are even when everything else changes." Margaret noticed a particular photograph that Emma handled with special care, a picture of Rosa holding a much younger Emma, both of them laughing at something outside the camera's view. Rosa looked healthier in the photo, her face fuller, her eyes bright with the kind of joy that had been absent from the pale, unconscious woman in the hospital bed. "When was this taken?" Margaret asked gently. "Last summer at the county fair. Mama saved up for weeks so we could go. She won me a stuffed elephant at the ring toss game, and we shared a funnel cake." Emma's voice carried the wistful tone of someone much older than her 8 years. "That was before Daddy left and before Mama started getting sick." Jennifer Walsh was methodically documenting everything: the condition of the apartment, the adequacy of Emma's bedroom, the contents of the refrigerator and cabinets. Margaret watched her make notes about minimal food stores and evidence of financial stress, accurate observations that nonetheless felt like judgments against a mother who was clearly doing her best with limited resources. "Emma," Jennifer said, "can you show me where you do your homework?" Emma led them to her bedroom, a small space that had been transformed into a child's sanctuary through Rosa's careful attention. The walls were painted a cheerful yellow, clearly a recent project, as Margaret could see faint pencil lines where Rosa had measured to ensure straight edges around the windows. A small desk held school supplies organized in mason jars, and Emma's bed was covered with a quilt that looked handmade. "Mama made that," Emma said, noticing Margaret's examination of the quilt. "She worked on it at night after I went to sleep. She said every stitch was a wish for good dreams." Margaret felt her throat tighten. This was not the home of a neglectful parent. This was the home of a mother who had poured love and creativity into making her daughter's life as stable and beautiful as possible, despite circumstances that would have defeated many people. "Mrs. Rodriguez seems to have created a caring environment," Margaret said to Jennifer, hoping her professional assessment might carry weight in whatever report would determine Emma's immediate future. "The home is clean and organized," Jennifer agreed, still writing. "But there are concerning indicators. The refrigerator suggests food insecurity. The mother's recent health crisis raises questions about her ability to provide adequate supervision, and Emma's father appears to have abandoned his responsibilities entirely. Sometimes good people face difficult circumstances through no fault of their own," Margaret said carefully. "That doesn't make them unfit parents." Jennifer looked up from her clipboard. "Mrs. Collins, I understand your concern for this family, but my job is to ensure Emma's safety and welfare. A mother who collapses from malnutrition and untreated medical conditions while caring for a young child, that's a red flag that can't be ignored." Emma had been listening to this exchange with the careful attention of a child who understood that her future was being decided. "Mama's not a bad mom," she said quietly. "She just gets tired sometimes because she works so hard. She cleans big houses for rich people, and sometimes they make her stay late or do extra things, and she can't say no because we need the money." "How often is your mama too tired to take care of you?" Jennifer asked, her voice gentle but probing. Emma considered this question seriously. "Sometimes she falls asleep on the couch after dinner, but she always makes sure I have food and clean clothes and help with homework first. And when she gets really tired, she teaches me how to do things for myself, how to make sandwiches, and how to call the clinic if something bad happens. She says knowing how to take care of yourself and others is the most important thing you can learn." Margaret recognized wisdom in Rosa's approach that went beyond conventional parenting advice. Rather than hiding their difficulties from Emma, Rosa had been teaching her daughter resilience and self-reliance while maintaining the security of unconditional love. It was a delicate balance that many parents in more comfortable circumstances failed to achieve. "I want to stay with the nurse lady," Emma said suddenly, looking directly at Jennifer. "Mama always said Mrs. Collins was someone we could trust, and she lives close to the hospital, so I can visit Mama every day." Jennifer consulted her paperwork. "Mrs. Collins, you mentioned earlier that you'd be willing to provide temporary care. Are you certain you understand what that would involve? This could extend for several weeks, depending on Mrs. Rodriguez's recovery and our assessment of the family situation." Margaret looked around the small apartment one more time, taking in the evidence of a mother's love expressed through countless small gestures and sacrifices. She thought about her own empty house, the quiet evenings that stretched ahead with no purpose beyond her own comfort and convenience. Then she looked at Emma, who was watching her with the kind of hope that children reserve for adults who might actually help rather than simply process them through systems. "I'm certain," Margaret said. "Emma needs stability and continuity right now, not another disruption. I can provide that while her mother recovers." "There will be paperwork," Jennifer warned. "Background checks, home visits, regular reporting requirements. And if Mrs. Rodriguez's condition deteriorates, or if we determine that the home situation is unsafe—" "I understand," Margaret interrupted. "But right now, what Emma needs most is to know that someone cares about her welfare, not just her case number." As they prepared to leave the apartment, Emma carefully placed the family photograph back in the wooden treasure box. Margaret noticed Her whisper something too quiet to hear, but the reverent way she handled the image suggested a promise or a prayer. Perhaps both. Walking back to Margaret's car with Emma's small suitcase in hand, Margaret realized she had just committed to something that would change both their lives in ways she couldn't yet imagine. But for the first time in months, since Tom's death, had left her questioning her purpose. She felt like she was exactly where she needed to be. Margaret's house on Maple Street had been quiet for 8 months, but it had never felt as alive as it did the morning after Emma arrived. The sound of small feet padding down the hallway, the rustle of cereal being poured into a bowl, the soft humming of a child who was trying to be brave. These sounds filled spaces that Margaret hadn't realized were empty. Emma sat at the kitchen table, carefully eating her breakfast while studying the framed pictures that lined Margaret's windowsill. Most showed Margaret and Tom at various stages of their marriage, their wedding day, vacations to national parks, quiet moments in their garden. But one photograph seemed to particularly capture Emma's attention. Margaret in her younger nursing uniform, standing with a group of colleagues outside what looked like a different hospital. "Were you always a nurse?" Emma asked, pointing to the picture with her spoon. "Since I was about your age, I knew that's what I wanted to do," Margaret replied, pouring herself a second cup of coffee. "My grandmother was sick when I was little, and I spent a lot of time in hospitals with her. I watched how the nurses made her feel better, not just with medicine, but by listening to her and holding her hand when she was scared." Emma nodded seriously. "Mama says nurses are angels who wear regular clothes so they can sneak around helping people." The comment made Margaret smile, but it also reminded her of the conversation she needed to have with Emma about visiting her mother at the hospital. Dr. Henley had called early that morning with an update. Rosa was stable, but still weak, and the test results were revealing a more complex picture than anyone had initially realized. "Emma, I spoke with the doctor this morning about your mama. She's doing better, but she needs to stay in the hospital for a few more days while they figure out the best way to help her feel stronger." Emma's spoon stopped halfway to her mouth. "Is she going to die?" The directness of the question caught Margaret off guard, though she realized she should have expected it. Children who had experienced instability learned to ask the hard questions because they needed to know what they were facing. "No, sweetheart, your mama is not going to die, but she's been sick for longer than either of you realized, and it's going to take some time to help her get completely well. Can I see her today?" "This afternoon, after you get home from school." Emma's face brightened slightly at the mention of school, though Margaret noticed she still looked uncertain. "Will I go to my same school? Mrs. Patterson says some kids have to change schools when they go to foster homes." Margaret felt a pang at the casual way Emma mentioned foster homes, as if she had already been preparing herself for that possibility. "You'll go to your same school. I'll drive you there this morning and pick you up this afternoon, just like your mama would do if she could." The drive to Cedar Falls Elementary revealed another layer of Emma's character. She sat quietly in the passenger seat, watching familiar landmarks pass by, but Margaret could see her mentally preparing herself for the questions and attention that would inevitably come. Word traveled fast in small towns, and by now most people would know about Rosa's collapse and Emma's current living situation. "Emma," Margaret said as they pulled into the school parking lot, "if anyone asks you questions that make you uncomfortable, you can always tell them that your mama is getting better and you're staying with a friend. You don't owe anyone explanations about your private business. Will the other kids think there's something wrong with us?" The question revealed the depth of Emma's understanding about social dynamics and the way circumstances could shift a family's reputation in a small community. Margaret parked the car and turned to face Emma directly. "There's nothing wrong with your family. Your mama loves you very much, and sometimes even people who do everything right face difficulties that aren't their fault. Anyone who thinks less of you for that isn't worth worrying about." Emma's teacher, Mrs. Davidson, greeted them at the classroom door with the kind of professional warmth that Margaret recognized as someone who had experience with children in crisis. She had clearly been briefed on the situation and handled Emma's arrival with just the right balance of normalcy and underlying support. Margaret watched Emma walk into the classroom and immediately be surrounded by friends who seemed genuinely happy to see her. Whatever Emma's home circumstances, she was clearly well-liked and well-adjusted at school, another indication that Rosa had been succeeding as a parent despite their financial struggles. The morning at the clinic passed in routine activities, but Margaret found her attention constantly drifting to thoughts of Emma and Rosa. During her lunch break, she drove to the hospital to check on Rosa's condition and found her awake and alert for the first time since the collapse. "Mrs. Collins." Rosa's voice was weak but clear. "Emma, is she okay? They told me she's staying with you, but I need to know—" "She's fine," Margaret assured her, pulling a chair close to the hospital bed. "She's at school today, and she'll come visit you this afternoon. She's a remarkable little girl, Rosa. You should be very proud." Tears gathered in Rosa's eyes. "I tried so hard to keep everything together. I thought if I just worked harder, saved more, maybe got a second job, but my body just couldn't keep up. I kept telling myself that once I got through this rough patch, everything would be better." Margaret recognized the exhaustion in Rosa's voice that went beyond physical fatigue. It was the weariness that came from carrying too much responsibility for too long, with too little support. "Rosa, the doctor mentioned that you've been dealing with diabetes that wasn't properly managed. How long have you known?" "About 6 months. I went to the free clinic in the next county when I started feeling really tired all the time. They gave me some information and told me to follow up with my regular doctor, but I don't have insurance, and I couldn't afford the medications they wanted to prescribe." Rosa's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "I thought if I just watched what I ate and got more rest, I could manage it on my own." Margaret felt anger rise in her chest, not at Rosa, but at a system that forced a hard-working mother to choose between her health and her family's immediate needs. She had seen this scenario too many times over her career. People whose pride and circumstances prevented them from seeking help until crisis forced the issue. "You don't have to manage this alone anymore," Margaret said firmly. "There are programs, resources, people who can help, but first you need to focus on getting stronger. I can't afford— We'll figure that out. Right now, your job is to rest and let your body heal. Emma is safe and well cared for, and she'll be here every day until you're ready to come home." Rosa studied Margaret's face with the careful attention of someone who had learned to be cautious. "About accepting help. Why are you doing this? You don't even know us." Margaret considered the question, thinking about her own motivations and the unexpected sense of purpose she had discovered in the past 24 hours. "Because 37 years of nursing has taught me that sometimes the most important healing happens outside of medical procedures, and because Emma reminds me of why I became a nurse in the first place, to help people when they need it most." As Margaret prepared to leave, Rosa caught her hand with surprising strength. "Promise me something. If this gets too complicated, if Emma becomes too much trouble, please don't just disappear. She's lost too many people already. If you need to step back, help me find another solution first." The request revealed both Rosa's deep love for her daughter and her realistic understanding of how quickly good intentions could evaporate when faced with genuine difficulty. Margaret squeezed Rosa's hand gently. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, surprised by the conviction in her own voice. "We're going to get through this together." By the end of the first week, Margaret had fallen into a rhythm with Emma that felt surprisingly natural. Morning breakfast conversations, the drive to school, evening homework sessions at the kitchen table. These activities had begun to fill the spaces in Margaret's life that she hadn't realized were hollow until they were. Occupied by purpose again, But it was the evening rituals that revealed the most about both Emma and the depth of Rosa's parenting. Each night before bed, Emma would carefully write in a small notebook that she kept on the nightstand in Margaret's guest room, now temporarily transformed into a child's bedroom with additions from Emma's apartment and a few purchases Margaret had made to ensure comfort. "What do you write about?" Margaret asked one evening, noticing how seriously Emma approached this task. "I tell Mama about my day," Emma explained, her pencil moving carefully across the lined paper. "She always asks me 3 things at bedtime: what made me happy today, what made me worried, and what I learned. So I write it down for when she comes home, and then I can remember everything to tell her." Margaret watched Emma's careful handwriting document the mundane details that made up a child's world: a good grade on a spelling test, concern about a classmate who seemed sad, the discovery that Margaret's garden had late-blooming chrysanthemums. The notebook represented more than just record-keeping. It was Emma's way of maintaining connection with her mother and preserving the bedtime routine that had provided stability in their lives. "Would you like to take that to the hospital tomorrow? I think your mama would love to read about your week." Emma's face lit up with an expression of pure joy. "Really? You think she's strong enough for reading now?" "I think she's strong enough for stories about chrysanthemums and spelling tests," Margaret said gently. "Those are the kinds of things that help people get better." The hospital visits had become a cornerstone of their daily routine. Each afternoon after school, they would drive to Cedar Falls General, where Rosa was making slow but steady progress. The diabetes management was responding well to proper medication and nutrition, but the broader recovery involved rebuilding strength that had been depleted by months of inadequate self-care. What struck Margaret most during these visits was the dynamic between mother and daughter. Despite Rosa's weakened condition, she remained fully engaged with Emma's life, asking detailed questions about school, helping with homework when she felt up to it, maintaining the gentle discipline and guidance that had clearly been consistent throughout Emma's childhood. "Mrs. Collins," Rosa said during one visit while Emma was down the hall getting ice chips from the machine, "I need to ask you something that's been worrying me. Is this disrupting your life too much? I know you weren't planning to suddenly have an 8-year-old to care for." Margaret considered how to answer honestly. The truth was that Emma's presence had disrupted everything about her carefully ordered existence: her quiet evenings, her weekend routines, her freedom to work late or leave on impulse. But it had also filled her days with a sense of purpose that had been missing since Tom's death. "Rosa, I'm going to tell you something that might sound strange. These past 2 weeks with Emma have been the most meaningful I've had in months. She's taught me things about resilience and hope that I'd forgotten I needed to learn." "She is pretty remarkable," Rosa agreed, her voice carrying the mixture of pride and worry that Margaret recognized as universal to mothers facing uncertainty about their children's futures. "But I also know she can be challenging. She asks a lot of questions, and she has strong opinions about things, and sometimes she gets nightmares about her father leaving." This was the first time Rosa had mentioned Emma's nightmares, though Margaret had suspected they might be an issue. Emma occasionally seemed tired in the mornings, and once Margaret had heard soft crying from the guest room, but found Emma apparently asleep when she checked. "She hasn't had nightmares while staying with me," Margaret said carefully, "but if she does, we'll deal with it together. Children need to know it's safe to be scared sometimes." "Her father," Rosa started, then stopped, clearly struggling with how much to share. "He wasn't abusive, but he wasn't reliable either. He'd make promises about taking Emma places or spending time with her, and then something would come up: work, friends, other priorities. She learned not to count on him, but I think it hurt her more than she let on." Margaret thought about Emma's careful self-reliance, the way she approached new situations with a mixture of hope and caution, as if she had learned that disappointment was always possible but still worth risking. "Children are more resilient than we give them credit for," Margaret said. "Emma knows she's loved, by you, and now by me too. That's the foundation that will help her navigate whatever comes next." Rosa's eyes filled with tears. "I've been so afraid that I've damaged her somehow, working so much, being too tired, not being able to give her all the things other kids have." "Rosa, look at your daughter. Really look at her. She's kind, intelligent, responsible, and deeply loving. She handled a crisis with more maturity than many adults would show. Whatever you've been doing as her mother, it's working." Their conversation was interrupted by Emma's return, carefully carrying a cup of ice chips and chattering about a nurse who had shown her how the hospital ice machine worked. Margaret watched Rosa's face transform as Emma launched into a detailed explanation of hospital operations, her natural curiosity and confidence clearly inherited from her mother. That evening, as Margaret helped Emma with her reading homework, she found herself thinking about the unexpected ways that caring for others could heal the caregiver. Since Tom's death, she had been going through the motions of her life, working, sleeping, maintaining her house and health, but not really living with engagement or joy. Emma's presence had changed that. The simple act of preparing breakfast for someone else, of listening to stories about school friendships and playground dramas, of being needed for comfort and guidance. These activities had awakened something in Margaret that she hadn't realized was dormant. "Mrs. Collins," Emma said, looking up from her reading book, "when Mama comes home, will you still be our friend?" The question revealed Emma's careful management of her own expectations. She had learned not to assume that good things would last, but she was brave enough to hope for them. "Emma, I will always be your friend. Your mama and I are going to figure out how to make sure your family has everything it needs to be healthy and happy. That might look different from how things are now, but the caring part won't change." Emma smiled and returned to her reading, but Margaret noticed her relax in a way that suggested the answer had provided genuine reassurance. As Margaret watched this resilient child navigate her homework with the same careful attention she brought to everything else, she realized that the question Emma had asked was one she should be asking herself. When Rosa came home and their temporary arrangement ended, would Margaret return to her quiet, purposeful, but ultimately lonely existence? Or had this experience changed her in ways that would reshape her understanding of what it meant to build a meaningful life? For the first time since Tom's death, Margaret found herself thinking about the future with something that felt like anticipation, rather than mere acceptance. Margaret was reviewing lab results at the clinic when Dr. Henley called with news that would change everything she thought she understood about the Rodriguez family situation. "Margaret, I need you to sit down for this." Patricia's voice carried an unusual tension. "We got Rosa's comprehensive blood work back, and there's something that doesn't add up with what she's told us about her medical history." "What do you mean?" Margaret asked, though something cold was already settling in her stomach. "The diabetes isn't recent, Margaret. Based on her hemoglobin A1C levels and some other markers, she's been dealing with this condition for at least 2 years, possibly longer. And there's something else. Evidence of previous hospitalization for diabetic ketoacidosis, probably within the last 18 months. Margaret felt the room shift around her. Rosa had specifically said she'd only known about the diabetes for 6 months, and she'd never mentioned any previous hospitalizations. "Are you certain about this?" "I ran the tests twice." "Margaret, there's more. I did some checking with other hospitals in the region, and Rosa Rodriguez was treated at Regional Medical Center 14 months ago for severe diabetic crisis. She was unconscious when she arrived, and according to their records, she left against medical advice after 2 days. The implications began cascading through Margaret's mind. Rosa had lied about her medical history, which meant she had been managing, or failing to manage, a serious chronic condition while caring for Emma for much longer than anyone realized. It also meant that Emma had likely been dealing with her mother's illness and its effects for months or even years. Did Emma know, Margaret asked, about the previous hospitalization? That's what we need to find out. Margaret, I have to report this to social services. A parent who conceals serious medical conditions and leaves the hospital against medical advice while caring for a young child. This changes our assessment of the home situation significantly. Margaret closed her eyes, thinking about Emma's mature self-reliance, her knowledge of how to seek help in emergencies, her careful management of her mother's moods and energy levels. Signs that Margaret had interpreted as evidence of good parenting might actually indicate that Emma had been functioning as a caregiver herself, taking on responsibilities far beyond what any 8-year-old should handle. I need to talk to Rosa before social services gets involved, Margaret said. There might be an explanation. Margaret, I understand your protective instincts, but this isn't just about Rosa anymore. If Emma has been essentially caring for herself and her mother for months, while Rosa hid a serious medical condition, that's medical neglect, regardless of Rosa's intentions. After ending the call, Margaret sat in her quiet office, staring at the graduation photograph that had seemed to judge her decisions over the past few weeks. She thought about Emma's careful responses during the social worker's initial interview, the way she had protected her mother, even while seeking help. Had Emma been covering for Rosa's condition long before the night she ran barefoot to the clinic? Margaret drove to the hospital with a heavy heart, knowing that the conversation she was about to have would either provide answers that made sense of everything or confirm her growing fear that Rosa had been deceiving everyone, including herself, about her ability to safely care for Emma. She found Rosa sitting up in bed, looking stronger than she had since her admission. Her color was better, and she seemed alert and engaged in a way that made Margaret's suspicions feel almost treacherous. Margaret, I was hoping you'd come by early today. I think they might let me go home soon, maybe by the weekend. I'm feeling so much better, and I miss Emma terribly. Rosa, we need to talk about your medical history. Margaret pulled the chair close to the bed, noting how Rosa's expression immediately became guarded. Dr. Henley received some test results that don't match what you've told us about when you were diagnosed with diabetes. Rosa was quiet for a long moment, and Margaret could see her calculating how much truth she could afford to reveal. What did the test show? That you've been diabetic for at least 2 years, possibly longer, and that you were hospitalized 14 months ago for diabetic ketoacidosis, a life-threatening condition. Rosa's face crumpled, and she covered it with her hands. When she looked up, her eyes were filled with tears, but also with something that looked like relief. I was so scared, she whispered. When I woke up in that hospital 14 months ago, they told me I could have died. They wanted to keep me for a week, run more tests, start me on insulin, teach me how to manage everything. But Emma was staying, with a neighbor who could only watch her for 2 days, and I didn't have insurance to cover a long stay, and I was terrified they'd report me to social services if they knew how sick I'd been. Margaret felt pieces clicking into place. So you left against medical advice? I thought I could figure it out on my own. They gave me some pamphlets and sample medications, and I tried to follow the diet recommendations. For a while, I felt better. Emma never knew how serious it was. I told her I had a stomach bug and needed to rest for a few days. But the condition got worse, gradually. So gradually that I kept telling myself it was just stress or being tired from work. I couldn't afford the medications they prescribed, and the free clinic could only do basic monitoring. I kept thinking, That if I could just make it through the current crisis, if I could save enough money or find better work or get Emma settled in school, then I could deal with the health issues properly. Margaret understood the impossible logic that had trapped Rosa in a cycle of denial and desperation. Each day of managing her condition inadequately made the next day slightly more dangerous, but addressing it properly required resources and stability that seemed increasingly out of reach. Rosa, Emma knew something was wrong, didn't she? She's been taking care of you and herself in ways that no 8-year-old should have to. Rosa's tears came harder now. She's so smart, Margaret. Too smart. She learned to recognize when I was having bad days and would make her own breakfast, get herself ready for school. She never complained when I was too tired to help with homework or when we had to skip activities because I couldn't drive. She just adapted to whatever I could manage. The picture that emerged was heartbreaking in its complexity. Rosa clearly loved Emma deeply and had tried to protect her from understanding the full severity of their situation. But Emma, with the acute perception that children develop when their security depends on reading adult emotions accurately, had been quietly taking on responsibilities that should have belonged to her mother. Does Emma know that your illness is serious, that it's not going to go away? I've tried to shield her from that. I kept thinking that once I got the right treatment, everything would go back to normal, that we could be a regular family again. Margaret thought about Emma's bedtime journal, her careful questions about Margaret's future involvement in their lives, her mature handling of crisis situations. Emma might not understand the medical details, but she certainly understood that her world was fundamentally unstable in ways that went beyond financial hardship. Rosa, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. During these past months when you've been struggling with your health, has Emma been safe? Has she been getting adequate food, supervision, medical care when she needs it? I've never let her go hungry. I've never left her alone overnight. When I was too sick to work, I made sure she still got to school, still had clean clothes. Rosa's voice carried the defensive edge of someone who knew her best efforts might not have been good enough. I know it wasn't perfect, but I was trying to keep us together until I could get better. Margaret believed Rosa's sincerity, but she also understood that Jennifer Walsh and the social services system would view this situation through a different lens. A chronically ill parent who had concealed the severity of her condition while a young child took on caregiver responsibilities. This would likely result in a much more intensive intervention than anyone had initially anticipated. Rosa, social services, is going to reassess your case when they learn about this. They're going to be concerned that Emma has been functioning as your caregiver, and they're going to want assurances that this pattern won't continue. Are they going to take her away from me? The question came out as barely more than a whisper. Margaret didn't have an answer that would provide comfort. The truth was that this revelation changed everything about Emma's situation and Rosa's fitness as a parent in the eyes of the system. But it also clarified something important about Emma's resilience and the depth of love that had sustained this family through impossible circumstances. We're going to fight for what's best for Emma, Margaret said finally. But Rosa, you have to be completely honest from now on. No more hiding, no more trying to manage this alone. Emma deserves a mother who's healthy enough to care for her properly. As Margaret prepared to leave, she realized that the simple story she had constructed about a family in temporary crisis had been replaced by something much more complex, a situation that would require courage, honesty, and resources from everyone involved if it was going to have a positive resolution. The emergency meeting was scheduled for the following morning at the hospital, bringing together all the parties whose decisions would determine Emma's future. Margaret arrived early, carrying a folder of documentation she had spent the entire night preparing, a comprehensive plan that she hoped might provide an alternative to the foster care placement that now seemed inevitable. Jennifer Walsh looked tired as she spread case files across the conference table in the hospital's small meeting room. Dr. Henley sat beside her, reviewing Rosa's medical records one final time. Margaret took a seat across from them, acutely aware that she was about to fight for a family that wasn't legally hers to protect. "Before we bring Rosa in," Jennifer said, "I want to make sure everyone understands the situation we're facing. We have a chronically ill mother who concealed the severity of her condition while allowing her 8-year-old daughter to function as a caregiver. This isn't a temporary crisis. This is a pattern of medical neglect that could have resulted in Emma's death if Rosa had collapsed while they were alone at home." Margaret felt anger rise in her chest at the clinical language that reduced Rosa's desperate attempts to keep her family together into bureaucratic categories of failure. "Jennifer, I've spent 2 weeks observing Emma, and I can tell you that she's one of the most well-adjusted, emotionally healthy children I've ever encountered. That doesn't happen by accident. Rosa may have made poor decisions about her medical care, but she's been an excellent mother in every other respect. Margaret, I appreciate your advocacy, but good intentions don't change the fact that Rosa put Emma at risk. What if she had fallen into a diabetic coma while Emma was at school? What if Emma had tried to care for her mother during a medical emergency instead of seeking help? We can't base placement decisions on what didn't happen." "Doctor," Henley looked up from her files, "there's another complication. Rosa's diabetes is now classified as brittle, difficult to control, even with proper medication and monitoring. She's going to require ongoing medical supervision, dietary management, and regular checkups. Given her history of non-compliance, the court is going to want assurances that she can maintain her health without compromising Emma's safety." Margaret opened her folder and spread her own documents across the table. "That's exactly what I want to discuss. I've spent the past 24 hours researching options, and I think there's a solution that serves everyone's best interests." Jennifer looked skeptical, but she gestured for Margaret to continue. "I want to propose a formal kinship care arrangement. I would become Emma's legal guardian while Rosa undergoes intensive medical treatment and learns to manage her diabetes properly. Emma would continue living with me, but maintain daily contact with her mother. Rosa would participate in a comprehensive diabetes education program, work with a financial counselor to address the underlying economic issues that contributed to her medical neglect, and demonstrate consistent health management for a period of 6 months before reassuming full custody." The room was quiet as Jennifer and Dr. Henley absorbed the proposal. Margaret continued before either could voice objections. "This approach allows Emma to maintain stability and continuity while ensuring Rosa gets the support she needs to become a healthier parent. It acknowledges the reality that this family's problems can't be solved by simply removing Emma from her mother's care. Rosa needs resources and education, not punishment." "Margaret," Jennifer said slowly, "what you're proposing is essentially a long-term foster placement with yourself as the caregiver. Are you prepared for the legal responsibilities that entails? The court supervision, the regular home visits, the requirement to facilitate Emma's relationship with her mother, even if conflicts arise?" Margaret had spent hours the previous night considering exactly these questions. Becoming Emma's legal guardian would mean submitting to a level of scrutiny and legal obligation that would fundamentally change her own life. It would mean court appearances, social worker evaluations, and the possibility that her decisions could be overruled by judges who might not understand the family's unique circumstances. "I'm prepared for whatever is required to keep Emma safe and keep this family together," Margaret said firmly. "But I want Rosa to understand that this arrangement depends on her full cooperation with medical treatment and complete honesty about her condition going forward." And if Rosa doesn't cooperate, if she reverts to hiding symptoms or skipping medical appointments, then we reassess. But I think Rosa has learned that trying to manage this alone doesn't work. She's ready to accept. Help! Dr. Henley leaned forward. Margaret, I need to ask you something personally. You're 62 years old, recently widowed, and you're talking about taking on the legal responsibility for raising a child. Have you really thought through what this would mean for your own life and future? The question forced Margaret to confront motivations. She wasn't entirely certain she understood herself. 3 weeks ago, she had been contemplating retirement, considering whether her years of service had reached their natural conclusion. Now she was proposing to take on the most significant responsibility of her life outside of her marriage. Dr. Henley, I've spent 37 years caring for other people's families during their worst moments. I've held dying patients' hands and comforted grieving relatives and guided new parents through their fears. But I've never had the opportunity to actually prevent a family from being destroyed by circumstances beyond their control. This is my chance to do something that matters, not just to treat the crisis, but to actually solve it. Jennifer was making notes, but Margaret could see her considering the proposal seriously. The court would require a comprehensive home study, background checks, financial verification, and ongoing monitoring. Rosa would need to sign consent forms, giving you temporary guardianship rights. And if this arrangement fails, Emma would likely be placed in traditional foster care rather than returned to her mother immediately. I understand the risks, Margaret said. But what's the alternative? Place Emma with strangers while Rosa struggles. To recover alone, that serves no one's best interests. There's something else we need to consider, Dr. Henley interjected. Rosa's financial situation contributed significantly to her medical neglect. Even with proper treatment, how will she afford ongoing care and medications? This isn't a problem that will be solved by education alone. Margaret had anticipated this concern as well. Rosa qualifies for several assistance programs that she hasn't been accessing: Medicaid, food assistance, utility help. Part of the problem has been that she didn't know how to navigate the system and was too proud to ask for help. I can guide her through those applications and help her develop a sustainable support network. And her employment situation? Cleaning houses is physically demanding work that may not be appropriate for someone with diabetes. We'll address that too. Rosa is intelligent and hardworking. She just needs opportunities that match her capabilities and health requirements. Jennifer looked at her watch. I think it's time to bring Rosa in and see how she responds to this proposal. But Margaret, I want you to understand that if you take guardianship of Emma, you're not just helping out temporarily. You're making a commitment that could last for years, and there's no guarantee that Rosa will be able to resume full custody, even if she complies with all our requirements. Margaret thought about Emma's bedtime journal, her careful questions about the future, her brave determination to protect her mother even when she was frightened and confused. She thought about Rosa's desperate love for her daughter and her willingness to risk everything rather than accept help that might separate them. And she thought about her own empty house, her purposeless evenings, her growing understanding that the most meaningful chapters of her life might still be ahead of her. I understand, she said, and I'm ready. When Rosa entered the conference room, Margaret could see immediately that she had been crying. Her face was pale, and her hands shook slightly as she took a seat beside Margaret. She looked like someone preparing to receive the worst possible news. Rosa, Jennifer began, we've been discussing Emma's placement options in light of the new information about your medical history. Mrs. Collins has made a proposal that might allow Emma to remain in stable care while you focus on your health. Would you like her to explain it to you? Margaret watched Rosa's face as she outlined the guardianship arrangement. noting how hope and fear alternated in her expressions. When Margaret finished explaining the plan, Rosa was quiet for a long moment. "You would really do that?" she asked finally. "You would take legal responsibility for Emma even though you barely know us?" "I know enough," Margaret replied. "I know that Emma loves you deeply and that you love her. I know that your family has been struggling with circumstances that would defeat many people, but you've kept Emma safe and happy despite impossible challenges. And I know that what you need isn't judgment, it's support." Rosa looked around the table at the faces of the professionals who held her family's future in their hands. "What happens if I can't? If I mess this up somehow? What happens to Emma?" "Then," Jennifer answered with the honesty that the situation required, "if you don't comply with the medical and legal requirements, Emma would likely be placed in traditional foster care. This guardianship arrangement with Mrs. Collins would be your family's best chance to stay together, but it's also your last chance." Rosa turned to Margaret with an expression that held both gratitude and terror. "Are you sure about this? Really sure? Because if you change your mind later, I don't think Emma could handle another loss." Margaret reached across the table and took Rosa's trembling hand in both of hers. "Rosa, I lost my husband 8 months ago, and since then I've been going through the motions of living without really feeling alive. Caring for Emma these past weeks has reminded me what it means to have purpose. I'm not doing this out of pity or obligation. I'm doing it because your daughter has become important to me, and because helping your family heal has become the most meaningful work of my life." For the first time since entering the room, Rosa smiled through her tears. "Then yes," she said, "yes, I accept your help, all of it." The hearing took place 3 weeks later in a small courtroom that smelled of old wood and nervous perspiration. Margaret sat in the front row, her hands folded carefully in her lap, watching as Judge Patricia Morrison reviewed the thick file that would determine Emma's future. Emma herself sat between Margaret and Rosa, wearing the blue dress that Margaret had bought for the occasion, something appropriate for court, but cheerful enough to remind everyone that they were discussing a child's life, not just a legal case. Judge Morrison was a woman in her 50s who had earned a reputation for fairness, but also for demanding accountability from everyone who appeared before her. Margaret had learned that she had been on the bench for 15 years and had presided over hundreds of family court cases. She was not someone who would be swayed by emotion alone. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Judge Morrison began, looking directly at Rosa, "I've reviewed your medical records and the reports from social services. Help me understand how a mother allows her diabetes to go untreated for nearly 2 years while caring for a young child." Rosa stood slowly, her voice barely audible at first. "Your Honor, I was scared. When I was first diagnosed, I didn't have insurance, and the medications they wanted to prescribe cost more than my rent. I thought if I could just manage it with diet and exercise, I could avoid the expense and keep working to support Emma. But you were hospitalized 14 months ago for diabetic ketoacidosis, a life-threatening condition. You left against medical advice. Why?" "Because Emma was staying with a neighbor who could only keep her for 2 days, and I was terrified that if the hospital learned how sick I was, they would report me to social services and take Emma away from me." Rosa's voice grew stronger as she continued. "I know it was the wrong decision, but at the time, keeping my daughter felt more important than following medical advice." Judge Morrison made notes as Rosa spoke, her expression revealing nothing. "Mrs. Rodriguez, your daughter was essentially functioning as your caregiver during periods when you were unable to properly care for yourself. How do you justify placing that burden on an 8-year-old child?" Margaret watched Emma's face during this exchange, noting how the child seemed to understand that her mother was being held accountable for decisions that had shaped Emma's entire world. Emma reached over and took Rosa's hand, a gesture of support that didn't go unnoticed by anyone in the courtroom. I tried to protect Emma from understanding how sick I was, Rosa said. I never asked her to take care of me. But she's always been observant and responsible, and she learned to help when I was having difficult days. I know that wasn't fair to her, but I didn't know what else to do. Mrs. Collins, Judge Morrison turned her attention to Margaret, you're proposing to become Emma's legal guardian, while Mrs. Rodriguez undergoes medical treatment and education. At 62 years old, with no previous experience as a parent, why do you believe you're qualified for this responsibility? Margaret rose, feeling the weight of every decision that had brought her to this moment. Your Honor, I've been a registered nurse for 37 years. I've spent my career caring for people during their most vulnerable moments, and I've learned to recognize the difference between families in crisis and families that are fundamentally dysfunctional. The Rodriguez family is dealing with medical and financial challenges that overwhelmed their resources, but the love and commitment between mother and daughter are obvious to anyone who spends time with them. That doesn't answer my question about your qualifications as a guardian. You're right, Margaret acknowledged. I don't have experience raising children, but I have experience helping people navigate complex medical conditions, advocating for families within healthcare systems and providing stability during periods of crisis. Emma needs someone who can support her relationship with her mother while ensuring her safety and education. I can provide that. Judge Morrison consulted her papers again. Ms. Walsh, what is the recommendation from social services? Jennifer Walsh stood to address the court. Your Honor, our initial assessment recommended foster care placement due to medical neglect. However, after observing the family dynamics and reviewing Mrs. Collins' proposal, we believe that kinship care with Mrs. Collins as guardian represents the best interest of the child, provided that strict conditions are met and monitored. What conditions? Mrs. Rodriguez must complete a comprehensive diabetes education program and demonstrate consistent medical compliance for 6 months. She must participate in family counseling to address the communication issues that led to Emma taking on inappropriate responsibilities. She must establish stable employment that accommodates her medical needs. And Mrs. Collins must undergo formal guardian training and submit to regular home visits and progress reports. Judge Morrison looked at Emma, who had been listening to every word, with the serious attention of someone whose life hung in the balance. Emma, do you understand what's happening here today? Emma stood up, her small voice carrying clearly through the courtroom. Yes, ma'am. Everyone is trying to figure out how to keep me and Mama together while making sure Mama stays healthy. How do you feel about staying with Mrs. Collins while your mother gets better? I feel safe with Mrs. Collins, Emma said simply. She takes good care of me, and she helps me take care of Mama too. And she promised me that no matter what happens, she'll always be our friend. The courtroom was quiet as Judge Morrison made her final notes. Margaret could feel her heart pounding as she waited for the decision that would determine whether her life would be forever changed by the responsibility of raising Emma, or whether this family would be separated by a system that couldn't find room for unconventional solutions to complex problems. Judge Morrison set down her pen and looked directly at each person in turn before speaking. The silence in the courtroom stretched until Margaret could hear her own heartbeat echoing in her ears. This is an unusual case, Judge Morrison began, because it requires the court to balance multiple competing interests. A child's need for stability, a mother's right to parent her child, and society's obligation to protect children from harm. Mrs. Rodriguez, your decisions regarding your medical care were irresponsible and placed your daughter at risk. However, I also recognize that you were facing impossible choices between your health and your family's immediate survival. Rosa's hand tightened around Emma's, and Margaret could see tears beginning to form in Rosa's eyes. Mrs. Collins, your proposal is commendable, but it represents a significant commitment that will fundamentally alter your life. The court cannot approve this arrangement unless I'm convinced that you fully understand the legal and personal responsibilities you're accepting. Margaret stood again. Your Honor, I understand that becoming Emma's guardian means I'll be legally responsible for her welfare, education, and medical care. I understand that I'll be subject to court supervision and regular evaluations. I understand that this arrangement could last for years, and that there's no guarantee Mrs. Rodriguez will be able to resume full custody. I also understand that Emma needs stability and continuity, and I'm prepared to provide that for as long as necessary. And if conflicts arise between you and Mrs. Rodriguez regarding Emma's care, then we'll work through them with the help of family counseling and the guidance of social services. Emma's welfare comes first, but maintaining her relationship with her mother is essential to that welfare. Judge Morrison turned back to Rosa. Mrs. Rodriguez, if I approve this guardianship arrangement, you'll be agreeing to legal supervision of your parenting for at least 6 months, possibly longer. You'll be required to attend medical appointments, education programs, and counseling sessions. You'll have to prove that you can manage your diabetes responsibly before considering reunification. Are you prepared for that level of oversight? Yes, Your Honor, Rosa said firmly. I know I made mistakes, but I love my daughter more than anything, and I'll do whatever it takes to prove that I can be the mother she deserves. Emma, Judge Morrison said gently, this decision affects you more than anyone else. Is there anything you want to tell the court about what you hope will happen? Emma stood up once more, her 8-year-old voice carrying a wisdom that made everyone in the courtroom lean forward to listen. I want to stay with Mrs. Collins because she makes me feel safe, and she helps me not be scared about Mama being sick. But I also want Mama to get better so we can be a real family again. I don't understand why that has to be hard for grown-ups to figure out. A slight smile crossed Judge Morrison's face at Emma's directness. You're absolutely right, Emma. It shouldn't be hard to figure out. The judge reviewed her notes one final time, and Margaret felt as though the entire courtroom was holding its breath. 3 weeks of preparation, documentation, and hope had led to this moment when a stranger would decide whether their unconventional family could stay together. After careful consideration of all the evidence and testimony, Judge Morrison announced, I'm approving the kinship care arrangement with the following conditions. Mrs. Margaret Collins is appointed temporary guardian of Emma Rodriguez for a period of 6 months, subject to renewal based on compliance with court orders. Mrs. Rosa Rodriguez will complete a comprehensive diabetes management program within 60 days and demonstrate consistent medical compliance for the duration of the guardianship. Both families will participate in monthly counseling sessions to address communication and relationship issues. Social services will conduct monthly home visits and provide progress reports to the court. Margaret felt her knees go weak with relief. But Judge Morrison wasn't finished. I want to be very clear about something. This arrangement is not a permanent solution. It's an opportunity for this family to heal and rebuild. Mrs. Rodriguez, you have 6 months to prove that you can manage your health responsibly while maintaining your role as Emma's mother. Mrs. Collins, you have 6 months to provide Emma with stability while facilitating her relationship with her mother. If either of you fails to meet these obligations, Emma will be placed in traditional foster care while the court reassesses the situation. The judge's gavel fell with a decisive sound that seemed to echo through Margaret's entire body. Around her, she could hear the rustle of papers and quiet conversations as the court reporter and attorneys began their administrative tasks, but all Margaret could focus on was Emma's face. The little girl who had run barefoot into the clinic 3 weeks ago was smiling with pure joy. her arms wrapped around both Margaret and Rosa in an embrace that included everyone who had fought to keep her family together. In that moment, Margaret realized that the climax wasn't just about a legal decision. It was about the moment when three people who had been struggling separately became a family committed to facing whatever challenges lay ahead together. "Can we go home now?" Emma asked, looking up at Margaret with trust and affection that made Margaret's chest tighten with emotion. "Yes, sweetheart," Margaret said, surprised by how natural the word home sounded when it included both Emma and Rosa. "We can go home." 6 months later, Margaret stood in her kitchen watching Emma help Rosa prepare Sunday dinner, a weekly tradition that had evolved naturally as Rosa's health stabilized and their unconventional family found its rhythm. The scene before her would have been unimaginable a year ago, her quiet house filled with the sounds of conversation, laughter, and the comfortable domestic chaos that came with raising a child. Rosa looked healthier than Margaret had ever seen. Her diabetes management had become routine, with blood sugar monitoring as automatic as brushing her teeth. The comprehensive education program had taught her not just about medication and diet, but about recognizing the early warning signs she had ignored for so long. More importantly, she had learned to ask for help instead of suffering in silence. "Mrs. Collins, can you check if the rolls are ready?" Emma called out, stirring the green beans with the serious concentration she brought to any task involving food preparation. Over the months, she had gradually relaxed her hypervigilance about her mother's condition, but she still enjoyed being involved in meal planning and preparation, activities that gave her a sense of control and contribution. Margaret opened the oven, releasing the aroma of fresh bread into the kitchen. "Perfect timing," she announced, noting how Rosa automatically checked her glucose monitor before tasting the sauce she was preparing. Small habits that had become second nature, evidence of how sustainable change happened through daily practice, rather than dramatic gestures. The guardianship arrangement had evolved into something none of them had quite anticipated. Rather than Emma simply staying with Margaret while Rosa recovered, they had gradually become an extended family unit. Rosa had moved into Margaret's guest bedroom 3 months earlier, when it became clear that separation was causing more stress than benefit for everyone involved. The court had approved the arrangement after reviewing progress reports that showed consistent medical compliance, successful family counseling, and Emma's continued emotional stability. "I got a letter from the court yesterday," Rosa said during dinner, her voice carrying excitement rather than the anxiety that legal correspondence had once provoked. "Judge Morrison is satisfied with our progress. She's recommending that we begin transitioning back to independent living, with Margaret maintaining legal guardianship for another 6 months as a safety net." Emma looked up from her plate. "Does that mean we're moving back to our old apartment?" "Actually," Rosa said, glancing at Margaret with a smile, "I found a small house to rent on the other side of town. 3 bedrooms, a yard for gardening, and close enough to Mrs. Collins that we can still have Sunday dinners together." Margaret felt a complex mixture of emotions at this news. Pride in Rosa's achievement of stability and independence, happiness for Emma's growing security, and yes, a touch of sadness at the thought of her house becoming quiet again. But it was a different kind of quiet than she had known after Tom's death. It would be the purposeful quiet of someone whose life was full of meaningful connections rather than the hollow quiet of isolation. "Will you help us move?" Emma asked Margaret. "And will you teach me how to plant a garden like yours?" "Of course," Margaret replied. "We'll plant herbs and vegetables, and maybe some flowers that bloom in different seasons so you always have something growing." The conversation continued around plans for the move, Emma's upcoming school year, and Rosa's new job at the clinic as a part-time medical assistant, a position that Dr. Harrison had created specifically for her, recognizing Both her reliability and her unique understanding of patients facing medical challenges. The work allowed her to use her experience constructively while maintaining the flexible schedule her health required. After dinner, as they cleaned up together, Margaret found herself reflecting on how naturally their roles had evolved. She was no longer Emma's temporary guardian or Rosa's helper during a crisis. She had become something like an honorary grandmother, someone whose involvement in their lives was wanted rather than needed, chosen rather than mandated by circumstance. "Margaret," Rosa said quietly while Emma was in the living room working on a puzzle, "I need to tell you something I've been thinking about for weeks. I know I can never repay you for what you've done for us, but I want you to know that you didn't just save Emma, you saved me too. Before this happened, I felt like I was drowning, trying to keep us afloat by myself. Now I feel like I have a future again." Margaret dried her hands on the dish towel, considering how to respond. "Rosa, you gave me something too. These months with Emma have been the most purposeful of my life. I thought my meaningful work was behind me, but caring for your family has shown me that the most important chapters might still be ahead." Emma appeared in the doorway, holding the completed puzzle, a colorful image of a garden in full bloom. "Look what I finished," she announced proudly. "It's like the garden we're going to plant together." Margaret looked at the puzzle, then at Emma's bright face, then at Rosa's expression of contentment and hope. A year ago, she had been a nurse approaching retirement, wondering if her best years were behind her. Now she was a guardian, a mentor, and an integral part of a family that had been forged not through genetics, but through choice, commitment, and love. The quiet desperation that had brought them together. A child's barefoot run through dark streets. A mother's collapse, a nurse's decision to step beyond professional duty, had transformed into something sustainable and beautiful. They had learned that healing sometimes required unconventional solutions, that families could be created as well as born, and that the courage to ask for and accept help could transform crisis into opportunity. As Margaret tucked Emma into bed, that night, the child looked up at her with the same trust she had shown that first frightening evening at the clinic. "Mrs. Collins," Emma said sleepily, "when we move to the new house, will you still be my guardian?" "For as long as you need me to be," Margaret replied, smoothing Emma's hair, "and long after that, I'll still be your friend." Emma smiled and closed her eyes, secure in the knowledge that the adults in her life had learned to take care of themselves and each other, creating the stability that every child deserves. Margaret stood in the doorway for a moment, watching Emma sleep peacefully before returning to the living room where Rosa was reading a book about diabetes management, no longer studying out of desperation, but continuing to learn as part of a lifetime commitment to her own health and her daughter's security. Outside, Cedar Falls settled into its evening routine, a small town where one nurse's decision to extend care beyond professional obligation had changed 3 lives forever, proving that sometimes the most profound healing happens not in hospitals, but in the courage to create family, from the willingness to love and be loved in return.